and welcome to the latest in the MuleSoft webinar series, Top 3 Considerations for Integrating Hybrid Environments. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a couple of webinar logistics. This webinar is being recorded, and you will have access to the recording once the webinar is over. If you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to ask them at any time using the questions button. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you hear something you like, we encourage you to engage on Twitter using the official hashtag MuleSoftWebinar. And finally, if you have any questions about a particular use case, you can submit them to our team of integration experts at mulesoft.com/ask. With that, we'll transition over to our presenters, Chris Purpura and Dan Diephouse.
Hi, thanks very much, Allison. Thanks for giving us your time today. We like doing these webinar series. It's a good way to engage with the community out there. And today we're talking about hybrid integration. And before we get started on kind of some of the key considerations and some of the issues involved in hybrid integration, we should talk about why we're even having this discussion. So we all know that the world is absolutely bursting with things that need connectivity. And more often than not, the things that we need to connect to are sitting locked up inside of our enterprises. There are over 2,400 cloud applications today. So if we've all heard the term software as a service. There's a vibrant community of ISVs. Pretty much every new ISV and even older applications company has moved to the cloud. And whether you know it or not, inside of your enterprise, your company has been adopting these applications for, in some cases, years, and in some cases more than 10 years. Salesforce.com is more than 10 years old, probably the most predominant SaaS company out there. Forbes magazine even just recently did a CIO survey where the average number of SaaS applications that most CIOs are aware of is over 17. So whether you know about it or not, in your enterprise today, you probably have these SaaS applications throughout many departments.
Yeah, I think what do we have, Chris? We have over 100 or something like that, and we're a pretty small company to begin with.
Well, I think the challenge typically is still around shadow IT. So I know that at MuleSoft, we run our business entirely on the cloud. Finance is aware of about 22 applications that we pay subscriptions on. But when we surveyed employees, there were over 80 different applications that people were using. So it gives you some sense of the scope of kind of the self-serve adoption that's gone on throughout the enterprise, because it's so easy to just create an account off these SaaS applications, in some cases swipe a credit card and get going. And what that's doing is it's creating a need for data and data interaction between these applications and systems that you already have in the enterprise. And evidence of this user adoption can be seen by some of the massive amounts of data that are now being created from the cloud, from mobile, from all sorts of endpoints. And that data in general is going back into your enterprise and interacting with your corporate data in some way. This problem will actually only get worse as we see the explosion of remote devices. We've all experienced the phenomenon of smartphones, but increasingly we will start to see devices that don't belong in the phone category. We see it in health devices, we see it in industrial devices, we see it in telematics devices that live in cars and trucks, we see it in road sensors, we see it in product SKUs and product inventory. The number of devices is really set to explode. So this problem is not going away, it's only going to get bigger. So how does that come back in and affect the enterprise? And in particular, what does enterprise IT professionals, what do we all do about what's happening around us? Well, we've talked a little bit about the adoption of line of business applications, and that's creating these data silos at really a cloud speed, pun intended, I guess. But in addition, you also have new initiatives around mobile. You have increasingly number of initiatives around your web properties, or if you're in retail, your retail stores. Because every customer interaction, whether it's through a mobile device, through your website, through a point of presence like a retail store, all of these interactions are now being captured digitally. And every time those things are captured, That's creating events, it's creating data, and it needs to interact with your systems of record. Lastly, those systems of record really aren't going away. Most of our customers have massive investments in, we could call them legacy apps, but in many cases, those apps are highly relevant. Whether they're a packaged ERP system that's been implemented over many years, and most customers have tens to hundreds of millions invested in those systems, or whether they're custom internal systems that have been created that are very proprietary to your business but critical to your business. And the challenge then is, hey, I can't rip those out, so they start to work with the cloud and work with SaaS or work with mobile. How do I begin to modernize it? How do I extend these applications? And how do I get them to where they can interact and really add a lot of value to what's happening out at the edges of your corporation? So what does it start to look like? One of the challenges that we see is, again, these systems don't get to go away. You have mass proliferation around the edges. And the result typically, when there's not a solid approach to hybrid integration, when there's not a solid platform in the middle and a solid architecture that's been well thought through, is that you end up with all kinds of problems. You end up with inconsistent data, you end up with missing data, you end up with because of the inconsistent missing data, things not connected. What you end up with is a disjointed customer and employee experience. So we've all been in the situation where we've interacted with a business, and now we need to call an 800 number, and they don't even understand what your history is with that business. They might not even be aware of your last couple transactions because the data has not been propagated to the system that the call center agent's looking at. I can't tell you how many times I've had to, ask people to look in another system. You'll usually ask, "Hey, do you have other tabs?" "Oh yeah, I have these other tabs. They're not open." "Why don't you go look in one of those tabs?" I literally had this discussion yesterday with a business, and because I'm in the space, my tolerance for that inconsistency is very, very low. And we see this in customer sat, and it becomes even more pronounced and more important now because people can get on things like Twitter and Facebook and other places and vent about how bad your service is as a business. So this ends up really affecting your brand. It affects top line revenue, and it becomes just critically important to solve this the right way. So before we sort of dive into some of the deeper considerations, we wanted to share some patterns that we're seeing across our customer base and across even prospective conversations. And this is sort of what we call the evolution of integration around SaaS. And so what we try to do is kind of lay it out in some steps here. And typically what we see is the first thing we see people do when they implement their first SaaS application, and this happens predominantly in a line of business, and it's likely not even visible to an IT department, is people will somehow get data out of the corporate systems, they'll get it into a flat file, and they will just try and load it into their SaaS system. So if you can imagine, you sign up for a SaaS application, it's empty. How do I load all my customer data into it? How do I pre-populate it? So there's this, it starts off with really a basic file upload that could come from a database, could come from another system, but it's a basic file upload. The problem is that upload's a one-time event, and what people end up needing to do is they need to actually sync it on a periodic basis. So then we start to see people layering in complex scheduled FTP jobs, or they start to buy some simple tools that allow them to do FTP out of a database up into their cloud system, or they'll buy a cloud-based type ETL tool which will do scheduled extract, transforms, and then loads into these other systems. And that typically works for sort of a point-to-point kind of use case, and we've even seen people sort of extend that out when they've got a handful of applications in the cloud. And what they end up with is a bunch of point-to-point integrations that are running independent of each other. And as that starts to proliferate more and more, these processes, these batch jobs, are actually completely independent of each other, and that's where things start to get out of sync because you cannot begin to coordinate all of these independent jobs. And typically they're done by independent developers because there's not really a good team environment, and Dan will talk about that in a little bit. So as SaaS adoption gets deeper and you start getting into more and more systems, what we see is people start to look at more traditional process orchestration. We see things being more automated and event-driven, and this is where you start to see actually traditional service-oriented architecture principles start to enter into the conversation and into their thinking. The more sophisticated customers then start to realize that they've even got a number of these services that are orchestrating across SaaS and ground, and that those services now need to be shared with other groups. So you might get a very solid official order-to-cash process down. Well, as you start to then open up maybe new channels, or people want to start to access that process from a new system, whether it's on the web like an e-commerce system or from a mobile application, they don't want to reinvent the wheel. The way you want order processes to go should be the same, or at least should have some governance around it. And so that's where customers then start to move into the world of turning that into a shared service. And because that shared service needs to be consumed more and more by mobile developers or web developers who aren't traditionally, they're not trained in things like SOAP and WSDL. If you look at technologies from the last 10 years of SOA, they need to see that packaged as APIs. And more and more what we're starting to see is because the projects actually start as web projects or mobile projects, and those teams then start to drive requirements actually down the other way, we're seeing more sophisticated customers start with kind of the shared service and API approach first, as opposed to start with sort of the very simple point-to-point approaches. But that's where we have good IT involvement and good IT governance entering into these projects, which we always encourage the line of business and IT to be talking early and often, which is not something that has traditionally happened around cloud. As you can see, the complexity kind of goes up, but so does the importance. And so again, just to summarize, we see a lot of manual processes at the bottom. We see a lot of point tools coming in around sort of this, just getting beyond sort of uploading and loading the data. We see customers starting to evaluate more of a platform set of criteria. And in many cases, we're seeing a lot of customers having to reevaluate and re-platform their hybrid integration because they started at the bottom left of the screen. And as they've started to really see the big picture, they realize that they can't actually move into the world of services and APIs very easily or at all with some of the point tools. And then if APIs is where you're starting, and this we think is a growing trend, they're really starting with a platform because the number of APIs they want to publish, the ability to reach a large audience sort of requires a platform approach to it. And then as you have a lot of these APIs, what sits behind them are actually applications that talk to lots of things. The other word for that are integrations or services. So this is kind of the spectrum that we see. And of course, the value to the business actually is at the upper right. And so we're encouraging people to look between their short-term project and their medium-term and long-term vision and really start in an appropriate place for their company. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who spends an awful lot of time with our customers at a very technical level and is probably in more conversations than anybody else here at MuleSoft, and brings a really good perspective to some of the top considerations that we hear from our customers in terms of looking at hybrid integration. Dan?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I think Chris and I both spend a lot of time talking to our customers about their hybrid needs, and I think one of the first kind of questions we get is really around architecture. It's like, how should we be thinking about the architecture of our hybrid setup? Right, we've got stuff on the cloud, we've got stuff on the ground. Should we be looking at an on-premise solution? Should we be looking at a cloud solution? And the first question that we tend to ask is, where is your center of gravity? We see a big spectrum inside our client base of customers who are cloud only, all the way to no cloud, but the majority of them are somewhere in between. And if your applications are really for the most part in the cloud or the most part on premise, it really makes sense to kind of co-locate where your integrations run with those applications. But at the same time, you really need to also be thinking about the future, right? It's not only where are you now, but where are you going? And I think it's really important to think about how can my solution evolve as my business evolves, because we see more and more customers coming to us with a roadmap of saying, okay, we're going to be 80%, 90%, 100% cloud in a few years. So how do you help us get there? So I think a very important criteria there is, okay, if you want to start on premise, great, but the question is, how are you going to get to the cloud? So I think it's important to have not only a hybrid kind of SaaS on-premise business model, but a hybrid kind of platform where you can start in one place and go to the next. The second big area of questions that we get is around security and compliance. So the first thing I think it's important to start off and say is, okay, relax, it's okay. You've already got some data in the cloud. You're using Salesforce, you're using Workday, or any one of these applications. So it's really not a matter of is cloud secure. It's a matter of your company's policies and thinking through, okay, what data does my company allow in the cloud? What does it not? Because that's going to affect how you architect your integration as well. If your company, for instance, says no financial data in the cloud at all, that doesn't mean that you don't need to still connect to the cloud with an integration solution. So you still need a hybrid integration solution. But we see more and more people moving more and more of that data into the cloud. So they come to us asking, okay, how should we approach that? How should we take precautions around this sensitive and personal data? So I think it's very important to have a solution that deals with encryption. So you have secure communication between all your different endpoints. It's very important to take a look at what happens to your data at rest. As you get into these more complex integration scenarios where you do need a real iPaaS, you're using queuing, and you need to be thinking about, okay, well, how do I encrypt that data when it's at rest so it's secure? And things like Cloud Hub can actually do that transparently for you. The other big area around security and compliance that we get into is, how do I comply with local laws? And there's a lot of different countries out there with a lot of different regulations, and you need kind of a toolkit, if you will, to comply with these regulations. An example is the EU Data Protection Directive, which says, you cannot transfer personally identifiable information outside the EU without some type of safe harbor agreement. So, for instance, Cloud Hub allows you to keep all your data located in the EU, and you essentially don't have to worry about it going to the US. So it allows you to be compliant with your local laws fairly easily. And then lastly, around security, because you're living in a hybrid world, you need to figure out how you're going to securely access your data from your on-prem data center and get it back and forth from the cloud. So one of the ways that we help people connect to their on-premise systems is through something we call VPC. And VPC allows you to connect your internal network to the Anypoint platform. So you can securely access data in, say, SAP or any other on-premise application and synchronize it into Salesforce or expose subsets of it through an API for partners or for mobile. And what's really great about VPC is it's extremely IT friendly. It allows IT to connect at the hardware or software level through something like IPsec or SSL and configure it in a pretty scalable, highly available way, and a way where they can really control the fine-grained access to their internal systems and monitor it. So it gives you a lot of the scale of having an integration platform, but without necessarily having to wait for your IT team to do everything regarding setup on premise. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds, if you will. And the third big area, we end up talking to a lot of customers around hybrid about is kind of the scale time to value area. So we typically start to ask them, okay, what's the scope of your project? Because, as Chris was saying, you can come in at a lot of different points, but typically we see that people come in much more around data sync, and they're starting there. They're trying to get their systems integrated at the very beginning, but they have a larger vision, which involves getting that data out and getting a lot more value out of it by enabling people in the field to access it through mobile devices, by enabling their customers to integrate directly with them. And I think that's very important to take into consideration as you select a hybrid integration platform, because as you get more strategic, you really do need a platform. It's not just about these point-to-point tools or data sync, but it's around transactional stuff. It's around APIs and API management. And you really need to be thinking then, okay, well, how am I going to get the best time to value? Because you don't want to have to manage servers, right? You don't want to have to manage brokers for queuing. You want to just have a solution that scales for you out of the box. You want to find a solution which is globally available for your whole organization. So all these factors are really going to come into play as you select an integration platform, so you can scale your business and scale the amount of integration that you're doing, so your business is run very well and you're getting a lot more value out of all these business applications that you've purchased.
Great, thanks, Dan. So kind of with that, we want to quickly take you through a little bit sort of our approach to these problems and introduce you at least briefly to the Milsoft solution. So we believe very strongly that a unified platform for solving these problems is in order. That if you look historically at middleware, it's been very fragmented, and so you're trying to solve a fragmentation problem, and then you end up choosing specialty middleware for each different pieces of the problem. Really, as we see things moving more into the cloud, and again, whether it's all cloud or not, in our view of the world of the near future and even medium-term future is it's a hybrid cloud anyway. If you buy an app from different SaaS vendors, they're not running in the same cloud typically anyway. So you're already dealing with multiple, infrastructure clouds underneath. And really what people want to move to is just worrying about the applications and the data, so moving up a level. And as you do that, there are three things that really come into play. One is the notion of connectivity to and from SaaS applications through their APIs. The way you access these apps are through an API already. So, and in many ways, those SaaS applications become a shared service. They're shared by you and all the other tenants that use that application. So SaaS fundamentally is already an SOA-friendly architecture in the way that you work with it. Now, if you're starting with your on-prem systems, the question is, are those on-prem systems already service-enabled? Do they have interfaces? Can other people access them in a scalable, safe way, and all the ways Dan was talking about? If not, then I might want to service-enable them or put an API in front of them. So our platform supports that activity as well. And then lastly, when I put these things together, maybe I'm mashing together a subset of my enterprise system, combining that with some information and some activity that happens in some of my SaaS systems, and now I want to bring those together and expose them in sort of a unified API that then my mobile and web developers can consume to power their applications. Now you're getting into API creation, API publishing, and the whole life cycle around APIs. What you'd like is to have one platform that supports all those different things, and from a single IDE for your developers, for a single deployment platform for your DevOps folks, and being able to kind of look at these things holistically, even if you're just starting from one starting point. And that's really what we've brought together in the Anypoint platform from MuleSoft. If you're not familiar with MuleSoft, we are a late-stage private company. We've been growing triple-digit the last few years, year over year. We continue that kind of growth. And we have some of the biggest companies in the world deploying us in some very mission-critical environments that are predominantly hybrid. I would say most of our systems, regardless of where they run the integration, whether they run our software on-prem or whether they use our cloud platform, if you look at the fundamental projects and use cases of our largest customers, they all touch something external out in the cloud and bring it together with things that live internally. So from a MuleSoft perspective, hybrid's already been here for the last couple of years, and we continue to deepen our experience by the interesting projects that our clients are deploying. If you look at some of the key results that we see and some of the business drivers around this of how people view the results of these projects, we've got large media companies that have they're sitting on tremendous assets of content that they license. They've got these huge delivery networks, big telecom type networks, and the trick now is, okay, as people move to tablets and smartphones, how do I begin to monetize my existing content I've already paid for? I want to now sell that to many more users. I want to charge for it in many new ways. I want to syndicate my content out to new channel partners that can then further distribute my content. And all of that requires a new content delivery network type of system. So imagine, private Netflix type of custom branded applications. And what we've seen there is we've seen, customers stitch together some off-the-shelf SaaS type of systems with their internal content, their internal CDNs, and bring that together in the form of new web or in predominantly tablet and smartphone applications to drive new revenue streams. In addition, we've seen large tech companies who realize they've got multiple services, and by connecting things behind the scenes, they can cross-sell consumer users of a particular service with another service. So if you're filing tax preparation and now you may want to use auto payments or internet banking to get your refund, things like that. Those things can be cross-sold to you in the context of doing your taxes, and that generates tremendous amount of new revenue streams for this particular vendor. Thirdly, the large pharma customer, and I'll talk about this one in a minute, but in some detail. But how do I serve doctors around the world? How do I educate them? How do I get them to interact with my brands so that they're not only ordering samples but writing more prescriptions for my drugs, for my prescription drugs? And how do I make that experience excellent for those doctors? And then lastly, we have many customers that fit the last description here. A couple in particular in pharmacy payments, in manufacturing, and many other verticals where they're just seeing massive time to value and speed up of projects to be able to deliver either a new service for a new market or just supporting sort of exploding growth because they've connected into new markets digitally, and that's driving a lot more traffic through their systems. And so being able to handle that increase in transaction volume. So one in particular that we'll just kind of dive into a little bit to give you kind of a picture of how these different pieces come together. So we have a large pharmaceutical company. The problem they're trying to solve is they need a way to reach doctors around the world in 44 countries. They have websites in every country, and in each country there's multiple brand managers for the different prescription drugs that they manufacture and sell. And so what they ended up with was a very fragmented web experience where in every country people were rolling their own website, and all the interactions that these physicians had were sort of being either siloed into a local database or they would just sort of fall on the floor. And so at a corporate level, they had a strategy to kind of pull all these pieces together. And the way that they wanted to solve this sort of distributed problem of not only sort of capturing all the interactions that the physicians had, but also eventually getting that information back into their sales organization so that they could provide a better service to those physicians when they meet face-to-face. And then thirdly, they want to be able to support a mobile experience for these physicians, is they wanted to put a digital marketing layer in place, a set of services that the people that build these websites could consume, or that the administrators that administer their sales automation application could consume, and that data would be distributed out to the people that need to get access to it. The problem was their starting point was they had a bunch of custom applications that did some of this. They had some packaged applications that controlled a number of these functions, and they had spent time actually putting an SOA layer in place with a legacy service bus. But that service bus, it was fairly brittle. The web services were very complex. They were written in SOAP, and the developers that are building the apps at the upper edge, they're more like a 25-year-old JavaScript programmer. They don't really want to learn SOAP and WSDL. They certainly don't want to learn how to talk to SAP, as an example. So what they're trying to put in place is sort of an agility layer and a new service layer that would sit in between these two worlds and speed up the one at the top, but to power it with the key data that sits in the enterprise. So they put our cloud platform in place, our endpoint platform in place, and then they started to stand up a couple different new applications. And these applications are written as services and exposed as APIs. So the first one really was, how do I tie together some legacy identity management data out of the systems at the bottom? I want to populate then a new SaaS application called Janrain to become the system of record. And then but in addition, as doctors come in and I need to verify their identity and I need to validate that they're a licensed physician, because remember, this is all a regulated environment. As you go internationally, to do that, there are third-party systems that are run in different countries by governments in many cases that are accessed through an API. So I can call a physician registration service in a particular country, put in a physician's name, and get back, yes, they're licensed, and yes, they're this kind of doctor. And that information then updates the doctor's profile in Janrain, and then as people build the web system on top or the mobile system on top, determining what that physician, one, that they're authorized to use the system, and two, what kind of physician are they. You don't necessarily want your podiatrist ordering lots of Viagra, right? That doesn't really, well, in some ways it goes together. Doesn't really go together from a regulatory standpoint. So, that's what the identity service attempts to solve. In addition to that, you have the interaction service, which is capturing all the social and cookie type interactions. That feeds big data, feeds the customer master system, and it begins to augment marketing automation type of campaigns and narrowing the experience for that physician, so they're not getting spammed. They're getting things that are relevant to them based on what they interact with through the web portal or through the mobile application. There's an e-learning component where you can learn about new drugs, and that gets recorded so that you update again the physician's profile around they've been trained in these things. And then lastly is the ability to be able to order samples and make that a very easy thing. So if people want to resupply with samples, that should be as simple as tapping a few things on the phone on your smartphone, and your samples show up on time. And that's really key for this enterprise customer, because if it's easier to get a competitor's samples, then the physician will write those prescriptions instead. So this stuff all very much touches the revenue top line for the business, and it also then feeds their sales organization with more real-time data, so those folks can provide a better service as well. The last component of this is, in order to make this all work and be secure, they had put together our VPC that Dan was talking about earlier, and in addition, they're setting up in different global zones in Europe and throughout Asia, with additional VPCs so that they can provide these services in all the markets that they operate. So to wrap up, just to leave you with three thoughts. Number one is, really think long and hard about your needs. Think about short-term problems and medium and long-term, and think about the need. Do I need a unified platform? Am I eventually going to get to APIs if I'm starting with very simple SaaS integration? If I'm starting with APIs, that it's not just the API, but it's going to need to connect to things behind it. So really thinking sort of broadly about the kind of platform you need to put in place. Secondly, you really want something that has low friction. If you're doing hybrid integration, the actual customer expectation is that the integration is going to be at the speed of the cloud and be as easy as it is to sign up for things in the cloud. And so you need a new platform and a new experience for your architects and your developers to be able to do this quickly. Not just get it deployed, but handle change, because the cloud is nothing but constant change. And again, lastly, you want something that's future-proof. So if you're not ready to put your integrations on the cloud, you might want to run them internally. You might want to run your API gateways even internally. You can start there, and as your company is more comfortable, you can actually move these things out to the cloud without any changes. So you're really able to kind of go any direction that you want. And you can even split your world and run things in a federated way, where you have some things that live internally and some things that live externally. And that all works seamlessly on our platform as well.
Thank you, Chris and Dan. Before we move to Q&A, I'd like to go over a few webinar logistics for anyone who might have joined us a bit late. This webinar is being recorded, and you will have access to the recording once the webinar is over. If you have a question, now's the time to send them in. You can do this by clicking the questions button at the top of your screen. If you'd like to share something you liked in this webinar, we encourage you to engage on Twitter using the official hashtag MuleSoftWebinar. And finally, if you have any questions about a particular use case, or if your question does not get answered during Q&A, you can submit them to our team of integration experts at mulesoft.com/ask. And now we're ready to take our first question.
Great. So let's see. The first question I see is, we already have an ETL tool and multiple ESBs. Why should I look at adding an iPaaS? Well, I think so. That's actually a very common situation. I think for customers that already have investments in those things, I think you have to look at what you're using them for. So in the case of ETL, most ETL use is really around analytics and BI and reporting. If you're using an ETL tool sort of in the middle of transactional systems, you might look at why. It may be doing being used around this kind of data sync, which is, there's a lot of that out there for doing just basic SaaS sync. And then I guess the question would be on the ETL side is, are you moving to where you have more process orchestration, where you're combining things across systems, as opposed to ETL is inherently kind of point to point. And if you're moving into this world of sort of integrated process flows, where things are getting split and aggregated and whatnot, now you're more into ESB land in the traditional sense. And then, yes, we have a lot of customers that have existing ESBs as well, and those ESBs are typically designed around internal integrations. They're very, JMS centric. They're very web service centric, and they typically have a development environment that's fairly proprietary and uses very complex things like Beeples and other heavyweight standards. iPaaS can support a lot of that, and certainly we connect directly into lots of internal systems. But I think things you might want to look at in terms of an iPaaS is, is it a very cloud and restful type environment? The technologies that are being used in the cloud are very different than the technologies being used on-prem. The iPaaS sort of also pre-packages a lot of the things around a traditional ESB for you, like queuing, and it takes care of obviously all of the hardware infrastructure, so things like clustering and failover and all of that are provided by the platform. I think even tying into all the modern security technologies as well, which in some cases have been bolted on to older ESBs, but are kind of baked in from the beginning in an iPaaS.
And another thing I wanted to just bring up is kind of like skill sets, right? Because Generally people don't like to kind of rip and replace, but sometimes we see people who want to kind of standardize on kind of one tool set at least going forward, and train people on kind of one thing. So that's kind of a consideration as people kind of select a platform and they've already got an existing technology out there. It's how are they going to support it? How are they going to continue to build on it? So just think it's one of those things to keep in mind. Maybe we should kind of move on to the next question. Like another one here is how should I think about APIs in a hybrid environment? Are there unique challenges there? So I think going back to the center of gravity thing, I think that's a very important consideration. Is where are you getting your data from? Are you getting your data from on-prem? Are you getting it from your SaaS systems? Because that's going to affect kind of where you locate a lot of your actual APIs, and definitely going to affect the security aspect of how you get to it.
Yeah, I think throttling is another key area because there's many. If you're putting an API in front of a system of record and that system of record is being used by your internal users, like your ERP system, the last thing you want is 50 million mobile devices hammering your ERP system to the ground. So I think as we see people start to layer APIs, we see kind of two patterns emerging. We see APIs for systems of record, and then we see APIs for systems of engagement or experience, if you will. So the APIs that we see being put in front of systems of record give sort of narrow views into the system of record, and there's strong governance and policies around throttling and security about who can have access to those things. As you move closer to the users, you see these systems of these APIs around experience, and those experiences actually are built a bit differently in terms of these APIs because they're much more compositions. They might be pulling some data from the systems of record, but they're combining that with other systems, and so there's different there's separation of concerns that we see that need to be taken into consideration as you split these things. And we've got some really great architects in our service organization that have done a number of these and can kind of go much deeper.
And I think that's one way you can address some security concerns if you have them internally as well, right? Is like people are sometimes IT is a little hesitant to allow you to connect directly to SAP. Well, a great hybrid strategy is to actually put an API in front of SAP on premise, which then allows you to kind of get out a subset of that data in the cloud. So you can build kind of data services, if you will, for different groups internally to access that data without getting access into everything, because then you can much more easily dynamically control access and authorization rules.
Yeah, I think you actually even just answered another question, said I don't want to give all users direct access to our enterprise systems. How could I give access to the information required but not everything? And I think you just nailed that one. So I think just in terms of answering another question.
And another one here is, what are some of the mistakes that we've seen in doing hybrid? I think Chris kind of hit on one earlier. It's where IT and line of business are not talking to each other, because I can give an example here around security, right? The integration team was trying to move as fast as possible and not trying to get access to the internal systems, and didn't really go through the proper internal process to get approved, and ended up setting them back a couple weeks because they had to now wait for that approval, and there was kind of a whole post discussion that was very painful. And if they would have had that discussion ahead of time, it could have a lot of their concerns could have been easily preempted, and the project could have stayed on schedule.
Yeah, I think another big mistake that I see, and I alluded to it in the beginning here, but it'd be good to call it out. And this is actually, the customer I have in mind is actually Splunk. They're one of our customers, and there's actually a prior webinar we did a few months back that you could probably look up to hear kind of it in more detail. But they were a great example of where every SaaS purchase that the business made brought in an integration tool, and before they knew it, they actually had six SaaS applications implemented, and 6 different integration tools, very narrow point tools. They literally got to a place where when things broke across these systems, they actually had no idea what broke or where, and they couldn't figure it out because they had to dive into 6 different tools, and many of those tools didn't even let them dive in. So they ended up very painfully, kind of a couple years in, having to go back and re-platform the whole thing, which they're doing on our Anypoint platform. But they have to systematically kind of unwind these point integrations. And so, I think the fundamental mistake is not having IT involved earlier on in these SaaS implementations. I think there's a motive by the business users to not involve IT if they think IT is going to slow them down. And so, being able to solve these things in a long-term way, but being able to do it at speed is really kind of what we try to give you. So I think that's all the time we have. If you've got further questions, please dive in to the MuleSoft.com/ask is a great place to ask them. Dan and I get those from time to time, so I'd encourage you to use those.
I'd like to thank our audience for joining and participating with us today, and I'd like to thank both Chris Purpura and Dan Diephouse for the great presentation. We hope you'll join us next time.